Hello, everyone, and welcome to Archaeologist. Guess what? It's officially 2 days from Halloween. As I said in my last video about the true story of Vlad Dracula, the figure who inspired arguably the most well-known figure in the genre of horror, Dracula, for the season of Halloween, I'm going to do two Halloween-themed videos. And today is the second. As I covered Dracula, a well-known inspiration for the vampire Dracula, I felt it would be appropriate and interesting to cover the traditional adversaries of vampires, the very famous vampire hunters. So today's video is an archaeologist's history of vampire hunters. So in our modern media, we often get generally two or we get several diverse views of vampire hunters. The most common by far is that of the figure of Abraham Van Helsing, the original villain of Dracula in Bram Stoker's novel, and the predominant villain, though not always, but generally the villain of Dracula in the various adaptations and reimaginings that have been produced in the 200 years since Bram Stoker published his novel. The other views we get are figures such as Blade, who is a Marvel superhero that is a vampire, which is something we'll talk about in a minute, who fights various horror figures, including vampires, including Dracula, as well as other monsters. And in the case of the vampires, we also have a very similar diverse views. In many cases, we have the traditional Bram Stoker model of Dracula, such as seen in Christopher Lee's adaptation of Bram Stoker's Dracula. Or in other cases, we have vampires that are much more obvious horror-esque monsters that also have things like Machiavellian, tactical, and supervillain like tendencies thrown in as well, as seen in the vampire Angelus, who is one of the main villains of the early seasons of the Buffy the Vampire series, in Vampire Slayer series. So before we get into the meat of the video, we need to go over a couple of definitions, like what is a vampire and what is a vampire hunter. So in layman's terms, a vampire hunter is an occupation that existed both in antiquity and in fiction, where a figure specializes in finding various supernatural monsters, including vampires, actually, and especially vampires. I mean, it's in the name, but anyways, and the figure is often described or shown as somebody with an extensive knowledge of the supernatural, again, especially vampires, with particular attention paid to on their weaknesses and how to kill them. And then in the case of vampires, it's a rather simple term. A vampire is a mythical creature that is essentially a revenant. A revenant is similar to a zombie, but not quite. Essentially, revenant is a figure who dies and comes back to life with all their mental faculties intact, that generally subsists on the vital living essence of a person. In many cases, blood, but not always, and we'll cover that later in the video. So, as I said, vampire hunters, rather than what we think as having first shown up in things like Bram Stoker's Dracula, they actually have quite a lot of antiquity to them, with one of the earliest being this figure here from the saga of Grettir the Strong. In fact, the namesake of the saga, Grettir the Strong himself, who, in the case of the saga, in the course of the saga, fought a variety of supernatural creatures, including a very powerful Draugr. Draugr being sort of a mix between zombies and vampires. A very powerful Draugr named Glommer, and he did eventually defeat him and kill him. Unfortunately, he also was cursed by Glommer, but that's a story for another day. And then we also have other examples from late medieval Europe and early modern Europe, and those are the Vampire, which were figures who were essentially half or part vampire. The lore is a little bit sparse on like and it's not consistent on how they're made. In some cases, they're born from a relationship between a vampire and a mortal. In other cases, they are people who were bitten but not quite turned, like something went wrong in the turning of them as a vampire. But either way, they were figures who were part vampire, who also, despite being part vampire, possessed all of the abilities, or at least some of the abilities, of the vampires themselves, without either all or at least without most of their weaknesses. And so this, in traditional lore, made them very good at hunting down vampires and other monsters. And then we also have the figures known as the Kresnik. So the Kresnik were vampire hunters in the Balkans, much like the Vampirs, but they were not originally that. They were actually originally so let me put it this way: the Kresniks were later evolutions of the Slavic god of the same name that you see here in this picture on the right. So the Slavic god Kresnik was a thunder deity, and possibly a later evolution, though it could be just a completely separate deity, of the Slavic and Nordic deity Perun, who in the mythology of the late medieval and early modern era battled the underworld deity of Veles, much in the same way that Perun did in Slavic mythology during the Viking ruled Rus period. And eventually, this duality between the thunder deity fighting a being of the underworld evolved into mythology about a group of individuals known as Kresnik, who would go out and hunt vampires either in person or by sort of astral projecting their spirit out in the form of a white wolf that would hunt down the spirit of vampires that would be in the shape of a black wolf. And very brutally, from what I understand, tearing the vampires apart. Now, of course, all three of these vampire hunting figures that I mentioned, Grettir the Strong, the Vampir, the Kresnik, are all mythical figures. But despite being mythical figures, they still had an influence on both the cultures of the regions that the mythology comes from, but also on the idea of vampire hunting itself. So the first stories we're going to look at are vampire hunts that were sanctioned by the Habsburg monarchy of both the Holy Roman Empire and Spain. And here's a little map to explain what I mean, because the the Habsburg monarchy originally was a Spanish monarchy, but they married in, with Red being the senior Habsburg family, but they eventually married into the Holy Roman Empire, monarchy of the Holy Roman Empire, as well as that of Hungary and Austria and Bohemia and such, and combined their empires. And so that made this part the senior family. And so our story today brings us to the easternmost part of the Habsburg domain, in specifically the region of Serbia. Essentially, at this point in time, Serbia was in a very precarious position, much like as I described, the Kingdom of Wallachia in the video about Vlad Dracula. Serbia was in a very precarious position of being in between the two superpowers, with the Habsburg-led Kingdom of Hungary and the Holy Roman Empire to the north, and the Ottoman Empire to the south. And during this point in time, the story that we're talking about today was Serbia was actually sort of in a small amount of peace due to a truce between the Habsburg monarchy and the Holy Roman Empire. And actually, in this region of Serbia and the southeastern Europe, which is called the Balkans traditionally, there were actually a few different sort of folkloric figures who could be counted as vampires. There was the Sorgoi, which would be sort of the stereotypical vampire figures that we see in our modern media. It's where figures like Dracula, and even Angelus that I mentioned come from. But they also had stories of the Strega, sort of vampiric witches, as well as the Vrylaukos, and I'm sure I butchered that, I apologize, from Greek folklore, which was a sort of vampiric bat monster that went out and hunted people. So the first case we're going to touch on is the case of Petar Blagojevic. So essentially what happened is Petar Blagojevic died. Not necessarily suddenly. We probably know it was slow for a variety of reasons that I'll get to later on in the section. But either way, he died. However, about 10 days after his death, his family reported that supposedly Petar Blagojevic knocked on their door, came into their house, like you see here. Supposedly he might have been killed by a vampire, and asked for his shoes. So in response to this rumor, as well as the rumors of a variety of deaths that Petar Blagojevic might have caused in the guise of this vampiric form, the Habsburgs sent a military surgeon named Frombold to investigate. And he, as shown in this picture, excavated a variety of graves, including Petar Blagojevic's grave, and found that the decomposition of the bodies was not necessarily, how to put this, as developed enough. Essentially, they weren't decomposed enough for his liking, and so he's like, vampires. And so he, working together with a variety of local law enforcement, dug up Petar Blagojevic's grave, among others, all the supposed victims of Petar Blagojevic, and and drove stakes through their hearts and chopped off their heads. However, this would not, after Frombold's destruction of Petar Blagojevic's body, this would not be the end of the supposed vampiric troubles in Serbia, because a couple of years later, yet another case came on. It came to the Habsburgs' attention, the case of Arnold Pioli. Again, I'm sure I probably butchered that a little bit. Arnold Pioli was a hajduk being essentially a pseudo-militia-like military group in the Balkans in Eastern Europe. And during Arnold Pioli's time as a hajduk, fighting in this aforementioned war between the Habsburgs and the Ottoman Empire, Arnold Pioli claimed that he had been accosted and attacked by a vampire. Now, he did, for the most part, live in relative peace for a few years during this time of truce between the Habsburgs and the Ottomans. But eventually, he would die of unconfirmed circumstances. Not suddenly, but of unknown circumstances. And after his death, he began to, rumors began to spread of Arnold Pioli supposedly rising from the grave and attacking people. Supposedly the witnesses said he attacked people and would kill those people. And of course, then eventually rumors spread that the people that Arnold Pioli's revenant had attacked would also rise, and etc. And it began to spiral out of control. So in response to these rumors, the Habsburgs sent 2 more military surgeons to investigate, surgeons by the name of Flukinger and Glaser. And following the example set by Frombold, Flukinger and Glaser exhumed the bodies of Arnold Pioli and all of his supposed victims, and found that the decomposition was not, they found that they weren't decomposed enough, whatever the hell that means, and decided vampires. And so they, much like Frombold, sometimes they would just chop off the body's head, they would set it on fire, drive iron stakes through it, you name it. However, this wouldn't be the end, because a couple of years later, supposedly Arnold Pioli had risen again, despite having been destroyed, and began to attack more people, and people began hearing rumors of figures being accosted by vampiric women and even vampiric children. And so, in response to this, Glasser and Flickinger were sent back, and they also they heard about various Hadyuks and or wives of Hadyuks being accosted and killed by these vampiric figures. So, as I said, Flickinger and Glasser were sent back to reinvestigate, and so this again they began working with the local law enforcement officials as well as the Hadyuks militias themselves, and began to re-exhume the bodies, including the bodies of Arno Pioli, and decided, up, they're vampires again, and drove more iron stakes through their heart, chopped off more heads, set more bodies on fire, and basically decided the deed is done. However, despite this event being essentially being deemed case closed by the Habsburg monarchy, how to put this, the fire had already been lit. So essentially, the sensation that had been caused by these two vampire epidemics that had been supposedly caused by Petar Blagojevich and Arno Pioli began to spread throughout Europe like wildfire. In some cases, you had Enlightenment philosophers like Voltaire sort of look at them side-eyed, and Voltaire sort of wrote a couple of poems making fun of Eastern Europe's superstitions. But in other cases, you had, let's see in this picture, people who called themselves demonologists, serious demonologists for that fact, take this stuff seriously, and so they began to write manuals and a variety of other things. In fact, it's during this period of time that we begin to see the spreading of vampire hunting kits. Now, and I want to make clear that these right here are not fake. There were legitimate vampire hunting kits that were spread out throughout the time. In fact, there are still several antique vampire hunting kits that you can find on, say, like eBay for thousands of dollars. Now, there were some that were faked, and that's important to note. But these are legitimate things that were spread around, and they could hold a variety of things, most often wooden or iron stakes, maybe an axe, like in the left picture, to chop off the head, various holy objects, herbs such as garlic, and actually vervain, or verbena is another term for it, an herb that is often overlooked that also had connotations of hurting vampires, also basil, you name it, holy water, etc. And figures who were demonologists and vampire hunters would often carry these around with them. It was also during this time that the superstitions about the dead began to really take off. And this is where we see burials like this one found in Venice, I want to believe, where skulls have bricks in their mouths. Because essentially what happened is a figure, maybe a grave digger, maybe just somebody passing by, having seen a newly dug grave and a body next to it about to be tossed in, what have you, and the figure having blood coming out of its mouth. Because, of course, in our modern knowledge, we know that in the decomposition, fluids, including blood and such, can come from all orifices, including the mouth. However, back then, nobody really knew about that. And so, crossing paths with somebody who has blood coming out of their mouth, you're like, oh shit, it's a vampire. And so one of the ideas that began to spread during this time, thanks to this vampire epidemic that had been spread thanks to due to the Habsburgs' vampire hunting expeditions, was that one could shove a brick in the mouth of a vampire, and it would somehow neutralize them. They wouldn't be able to chomp down on anybody and things like that. How, I still, in all of doing my research for this video, don't understand. I mean, one would think, vampires are supposed to be relatively intelligent and have the use of two hands that can pull the brick out of their mouth. But regardless of that, this was still one of the supposed ways one could neutralize a vampire, i.e. shoving a brick or some other object in their mouth to prevent them from being able to bite. Other defensive measures included things like burying individuals with say, like in this picture, with scythes above their necks. So if the vampire attempted to lean up, their head would be chopped off. Or or padlocks on their feet to prevent them from being able to get out. In other cases, cages above the grave. Or in the case of this picture, actually, two of what I just mentioned, the scythe, as well as, you can't see it in the picture, a padlock on the foot of this woman. It's actually a woman here, keeping her in the ground, but also the scythe on her neck, so if she even tried to lean up, her head would get chopped off. So now one must ask, well, we know vampires aren't real, or those of us who do believe in the supernatural to some degree due to our religious beliefs, oftentimes vampires are more spiritual beings and such. What caused this superstition? Why did all these people begin to die, and why did people begin to think that their deaths would lead them to becoming vampires? Well, during this time, one of the most brutal ways to die and one of the most superstition-ridden deaths was that of the bubonic plague. The bubonic plague, as far back as its outbreak in the 1400s, always has sort of supernatural connotations with it, and it can involve blood, somebody coughing up blood, and so in some cases, if you were try to test somebody's reflexes, some of the skin with black buboes or black dead skin on it, if you try to poke them, they wouldn't feel it, and that could be like construed in supernatural ways and things like that. In fact, as you see here, death and supernatural entities like the Grim Reaper were always connected to the Black Plague. And you can see this picture here, actually, of the Grim Reaper, or at least a figure I presume is a Grim Reaper or some other death-like figure, driving an arrow into the heart of this figure over here. So, of course, when people like Petar Blagovic and Arno Pioli die of unknown circumstances, or die while coughing up blood, or things like that, in an already superstitious society where you have a variety of supernatural creatures like the Strigoi and the Strega and the Vrilokos, and other figures like that feed on blood, you're going to have shocking and supernatural takes. Let me phrase it again. You're going to frame your view of what is happening in a supernatural view, because that's what the sort of views you have due to your environment. In many cases like that, like I said, you're passing by a body that is about to be thrown in the grave, and you see blood coming out of its mouth. You might assume, in a society that believes that vampires are real, you might assume that's a vampire. And in a society where people are dying by the hundreds, sometimes thousands, by the bubonic plague, that often involves blood coming out of the mouth as one of the symptoms, you have, again, the idea that these people are vampires. And then, as well as a lack of knowledge of how a body decomposes in the ground, and a lack of knowledge of, like, for example, one of the superstitions was, one of the claims in these investigations was like, oh, well, their nails were growing and their hair was growing. Of course, when the body decomposes, the skin contracts, and so, of course, the nails look longer and the hair looks longer, because actually the hair follicles under the skin and things like that. So, essentially, that's all of what has happened. It was the perfect storm of pre-existing superstitions, the existence of the Black Plague, of the bubonic plague, which, while not in while people weren't dying in as large numbers in the 1720s from the Black Plague as they were in the 1450s, when the last major epidemic had happened, it was still happening. The deaths by the bubonic plague were still happening, as well as a lack of knowledge of how decomposition works, was all that perfect storm that led to these investigations and the subsequent vampire craze throughout Europe. And again, here's a picture of sort of the connection of death with the bubonic plague. Okay, so now we move away from Europe and to Qing Dynasty China, where two political figures actually wrote about ways to dispose of the undead, specifically their version of vampires. And these individuals were Yuan Mei, who wrote the Zibu Yu, and Ji Jiaolan, who wrote the Yu Wei Sao Tong Biji. And in these books, they were writing of ways to dispose of a creature known as the Jiangshi, a vampiric undead creature who actually didn't feed on blood, but actually fed on qi, or the life force of a person, the life breath of a person. And Jiangshi was actually called sort of the hopping vampire, or the hopping zombie, or what have you, because they had incredibly powerful legs that could jump very far, and they generally moved around via hopping, supposedly, rather than walking. And in these books, Yuan Mei and Ji Jianlin talk about how one could, say, use a rooster's crow to scare away the Jiangshi, because it would alert the Jiangshi that the sun was coming out, and it would need to return to its lair, because Jiangshi, like many vampiric figures, were nocturnal. Talked about how various objects made of peachwood stakes, of course, but not just stakes, all various objects made out of peachwood could drive off and or kill the Jiangshi. And this is because the peach was connected to Taoist immortality. The peaches were, in general, overall connected to the concept of immortality. So, of course, something connected to the concept of immortality, especially the good version of immortality in Taoism, would be a useful tool to fight against a revenant, an undead creature like the Jiangshi. And they also talk about how symbols such as the Bagua symbol, the symbol that you see right here, here are some other variations of it. There are Taoist symbols that are connected to the various elements, and the concept of the Tao itself could be powerful tools to defeat and drive off a Jiangshi, as well as talking about how Taoist talismans could be used to defeat Jiangshi. In fact, it is the most common way shown in literature that is used to defeat Jiangshi, like seen in this Chinese movie right here. So essentially, let me put it this way. These two figures writing about how to defeat Jiangshi has often been described by historians as what if Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin wrote manuals on how to kill vampires? That's essentially what Yuan Mei and Zhu Jianlin were. They were very prominent political figures who were writing how to kill, in the Qing Dynasty, who were writing how to kill very supernatural creatures such as the Jiangshi. Furthermore, they were actually, rather than, say, writing them down as just horror stories that were fiction, Yuan Mei and Ji Jiaolan were talking about how these things were real. They were making claims that these things were real and telling people how to kill them. So again, these were very powerful political figures in the Qing Dynasty who were writing manuals on how to kill vampires. Very, very much would be an equivalent of Thomas Jefferson or Benjamin Franklin doing it. So now we have to ask, where did this superstition of Jiangshi come from? We know sort of how the superstition and the vampire panic in Europe developed, based off of the combination of pre-existing superstitious beliefs combined with the widespread death of the bubonic plague and the lack of knowledge on how decomposition works. How did the Jiangshi, in this similar regard, develop? Well, it's a little harder to pin down, but many academics have stated that the most likely origin of Jiangshi, because let me put it this way, Jiangxis have a very old antiquity going back well before the Qing Dynasty, at least as far back, considering their connection with Taoism, to the Warring States period when Taoism began to develop, maybe a little bit after. So it's very difficult to sort of pin this down. However, many academics have postulated that the best guess that they have is the way burial practices in certain parts of China were done. Essentially, oftentimes in many parts of China, a person would be placed either in a coffin or just their body themselves on these bamboo rods and would be taken, like you see in the picture, to their burial place. And this is further compounded by the possibility that in early times, when embalming science wasn't as advanced, like say back in the Han Dynasty and the Qing Dynasty and Warring States period, that perhaps the people who were carrying these bodies back home would, if they were, say, too far away from the home of the person who died, they would move mainly at night because night is cooler and it would help preserve the body, and the body's position hanging like this or in some other way on these bamboo rods being carried by these usually two, but maybe two or more individuals at a distance would look like the bodies were alive and hopping. And so this may have been what led to the evolution of the Jiangxi, or even just the idea, the distant memory of when people would just originally carry the dead bodies on the bamboo shoots and they would be hopping. As mythology and culture evolves, and those began to be, that method of transporting dead bodies began to be moved away from in favor of coffins and other things like that, the context of why that was done begins to go away, and eventually that evolves into the monster known as the Jiangxi. We may never know where the Jiangxi came from with 100%, but that's the best guess that many folklorists and historians can come up with. Okay, so now we move away from Asia and Europe and into New England, where we talk about the New England vampire man. Okay, so most of us know what New England is. The definition has changed a little bit, but generally New England can include states like Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, Vermont, Maine, in some cases Pennsylvania and New York. But either way, it's generally the most northeastern part of the U.S. And during the 1800s, we begin to see a very similar vampire panic to what was seen in Europe during the 1720s, with some of the earliest proposed vampire cases being found in the state of Rhode Island, where people such as Mercy L. Brown were purported to have died and then risen from the dead, and you can pretty much guess where it goes from there. So supposedly died coughing up blood and then rose from the dead, etc., etc. We also have examples in Connecticut from the Henry Ray family, the Ray family, in what is now Jewett City, Connecticut, who also all began dying randomly of unknown circumstances while coughing up blood. And the surviving members of the Ray family began to exhume the bodies, believing that they had been plagued by vampires. In fact, while I mentioned just these 2 points, Mercy Brown and Henry B. Ray, this was a common event that was going on throughout New England. For whatever reason, people in New England began to fear that they were being hunted and attacked by vampires. And this led to various New England authorities, both in the Mercy Brown case and the Henry Ray case in Jewett City, among others, going to these figures who were accused of being vampires, or being asked in the case of the Ray family to exhume the bodies of their family members because they feared that their family members were becoming vampires. Local authorities began to exhume these bodies, and as you can see, began to fire on them, cut off their heads, drive stakes to their hearts, burn them, etc. And in many cases, through archaeology, we can actually find the aftermaths of these hunting events. This is actually one of the Jewett City vampires themselves, where you can see the head is completely missing. In fact, the pandemic, the vampire epidemic in New England became such an issue that much of the U.S. actually began to make fun of New England for being superstitious, for being so superstitious. This is where you see various news articles throughout the U.S. making fun of vampires, talking about members of anti-vampire parties and things like that, and actually even American philosophers and writers such as Henry David Thoreau over here on the left, who also began to critique New England for being so superstitious, for actually believing that vampires were hunting down and killing people like Mercy Brown and Henry Ray. So that's an important difference with this. In contrast to what happened in Europe in the 1720s, where while philosophers such as Voltaire were critiquing the belief in vampires began to take off wildly. In the US, in the 1800s, the opposite began to happen. A small amount of people in the New England area began to believe in vampires, whereas the majority went the opposite way and were like, you're crazy, you're insane, you're superstitious, vampires are not real. And you can see that evidence in the news articles and in the writings of Henry David Thoreau. So that leads to the similar question to the last two sections. Well, if that's the case, then why, what was causing their deaths? Why did people begin to believe that vampires were hunting their family members down? Well, that's because the reason this happened is because during this time in the New England area, there was an epidemic of tuberculosis going on. And tuberculosis is a pretty well-known disease. In fact, we still have vaccination shots and treatment shots that happen to deal with tuberculosis because it's so well known about. Tuberculosis essentially tuberculosis is a disease of the lungs and causes the lining of the lungs, and this is a super simplistic description, so bear with me, but it causes the lining of the lungs to sort of crumble away, or whatever you want to call it. It causes the lungs to die, and of course it causes blood to fill into the lungs, and a person will often cough up blood due to this disease. And so there you have it. People begin dying while coughing up blood of unknown circumstances in an area with pre-existing superstitious beliefs. You begin to have the fear of vampires happen. And the main culprit, instead of being the bubonic plague this time, was tuberculosis. Now we have to move on to the next question. So we covered real-life vampire hunting events. We covered the Habsburg-sanctioned vampire hunting expeditions in Serbia. We covered the manuals of how to kill vampires written by Qing Dynasty politicians, as well as we covered the runaway superstition and hysteria of vampires in New England, in contrast to the general disbelief of vampires in the rest of the U.S. We now need to ask, well, what about the most well-known vampire hunting figure, Van Helsing? Was he complete fiction, or did he have a real inspiration? Well, he did. He had an inspiration in George Anderson Hellwig, who was a European scholar and politician who, much like Voltaire, fervently critiqued the belief in the supernatural. However, something that's important to note is instead of oh yeah, he was also a botanist. Let me make that clear. But anyways, instead of writing about vampires, this individual wrote about werewolves, and he was a very well-known botanist and academic and things like that, writing about the supernatural. However, he was, in contrast to, say, Yuan Mei or Li Jianlan, he was writing about how the superstitious creatures like werewolves and such didn't exist. And so he became actually one of the most well-known researchers of the supernatural, while also saying that the supernatural was horseshit. And so, while it's hard to prove, due to this German scientist and politician performing so much research on the supernatural, and Bram Stoker's extensive time in Germany as well as Transylvania and Wallachia, it's not hard to assume that he learned about George and or Helvig and created the German scientist Abraham van Helsing out of the inspiration of George Under Helvig. Again, hard to prove and not 100% certain if Bram Stoker did that or if he created Abraham von Helsing just completely out of nothing. But the parallels are very striking. So I at least think that there's a very high possibility that Abraham van Helsing was the later evolution of the real historical figure of George Ander Helvig. Okay, so with that, that ends our Halloween-themed video on the history of vampire hunters. We covered the mythological origins of vampire hunters in antiquity. We covered the Habsburg-sponsored vampire expeditions into Eastern Europe. We covered the vampire hunting manuals that were written by Qing Dynasty officials who were roughly equivalent to politicians like Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson. We covered the unique and runaway vampire hysteria, unique to the US and runaway vampire hysteria of the New England vampire panic. And we covered the very possible, though not 100% sure, inspiration for Abraham von Helsing, the most well-known vampire hunter. So I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you want me to cover any other supernatural themed history subjects in more depth next Halloween, please feel free to leave a comment. And remember to like, share, and subscribe, and I hope you all have a good day.